Okay, John, so over to you to introduce yourself.
Yep. So my name is John Fernandes. I'm a senior lecturer at Hartpury University, which is kind of in southwest England. Uh, I'm program manage the sport and exercise sciences degree and teach across the kind of range of exercise physiology and strength conditioning modules, and then have a kind of interest really in equality, diversity, and inclusion, mainly from kind of like personal experiences, which I'm sure we'll get onto.
Great stuff. And yeah, just to give people who are watching a bit more background as to how you and I connected, I think you'd been quite outspoken and critical during this sort of COVID webinar boom as to the lack of diversity that was being shown by some organisations.
Yeah, so it was exactly that, really. I think when a lot of conferences started getting cancelled and everyone kind of ended up being kind of locked down at home, there's kind of this proliferation in the amount of webinars and roundtables going online. And just kind of what I noticed from there, that there was just a kind of lack of diversity, just very a lack of females, a lack of minorities, and I know we're kind of maybe not in the best overall situation in sports sciences with the kind of amount of diversity that we have, but overwhelmingly the kind of faces look the same. And I took to Twitter like a keyboard warrior and decided to get tweeting and kind of raising my views, really. And then it just kind of stemmed from there. And then I think you noticed one of my tweets, which was kind of related to an organization suggesting that they've got stuff in the pipeline. And I just kind of said that, well, why does diversity have to be in the pipeline? Why can't it happen now? And then I think you sent me an email and then got on from there.
Great stuff. And can you just share with, just for the benefit of the recording, because I think everyone probably heard, but the sort of role that you've just obtained with Bases?
Yeah, so Bases a few weeks ago announced that they were going to have a equality, diversity and inclusion committee, which was going to see 8 people. And then I applied to go on that, and then fortunately heard I got a position this morning, so I'll be sitting on that.
Great
quite
stuff.
nice. Have a platform to make some good changes, hopefully.
Excellent. So yeah, congratulations, I guess, from not just myself, but from, I guess, our institute to you. I think it's, so we really appreciate you being here today because you're the right person for it by the sounds of things.
Hopefully.
Right, so I'll just share my screen and we'll get on to sort of one of your more recent tweets, which really just shared some experiences that yourself and some colleagues have had as a result of probably, I think it's fair to say prejudice, isn't it? And like a lack of diversity in the workplace.
Yeah. Cool. So to give you a bit of background, these are my 2 best mates. One of them is Ugandan, of Ugandan descent, and the other one is of Ghanaian descent. And we kind of were all born and raised in London. So these are just kind of some of the things that we had kind of talked about, that we kind of go through. The kind of, to give you a bit of the motive behind putting this post out, obviously kind of late May, George Floyd was murdered by police officers in America, and then there was this kind of the current intensity of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we were just kind of talking about it and noticed that a lot of people had suddenly come to this kind of term allyship and really against it. And I suppose what grated on us a little bit is that we had been sharing our experiences, because all 3 of us are really vocal about what we go through. And essentially we've kind of been telling people since we've been experiencing this stuff, which is probably as far as we can remember, from kind of, double figures in age. And it took, a guy being killed over the course of 8 minutes, 46 seconds for people to actually realize some of the stuff we're going through. And kind of one of the points we wanted to raise was that kind of you don't get any good credit for thinking that murdering a person because of the color of their skin is wrong. That's a default position in our opinion. what we kind of what we kind of not like where like, it sounds a bit weird, not like where they're kind of like holders of what's right and wrong, but what we might kind of understand is if you don't necessarily get the microaggressions, which are what these things are here.
Great stuff. So there was, yeah, this page, which I'm sure people might have had the time to read over the course of your speaking there, and then the second page, which has similar sort of incidents, and it's, yeah, I think that term microaggressions is really appropriate here, isn't it? It's something that we maybe just view as a little thing, or could be passed off as a little thing, but there's intent behind that, and it's a negative behavior.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with this, it's a kind of unconscious bias that people see us as different, even though we were kind of born and raised in the UK, in England, and we've lived here all our lives. And I think these are the things which they're more subtle, they're kind of harder to identify, and they're harder to prove, if that's the right word. And can get onto proof in a second. But these are the things which minority groups experience every day. You know, these are examples from us as kind of people of color, as it were. But you know, there'll be plenty for females, people, disabilities that they suffer every day. Really, I think it was Trevor Noah, the South African comedian, said like the thing with kind of British racism is that kind of you don't even know that you're being racially abused when it happens. So it's these kind of things where like people say something to you and you kind of a couple hours later you're like, that really happened. Like it kind of it's so subtle.
That's a problem in and of itself, isn't it?
Yeah, it is really. I think so. With that, you know, a lot of these things that happen to us, say for example, some of the work ones, like the colleague remarks, don't get reported because, like I said, it's kind of harder to prove. And someone will ask you, you know, it's not a scientific study, so you can't repeat this. You know, these things happen where it's not being filmed. Sometimes there's nobody about, so it's hard to convey what's happened. Really, until you put it all together and you kind of have this. But I suppose as far as determining whether it's true or not, I always say to people when they, so for example, the security guard one, I get that all the time. I had it last week, and what people often say to me, well, maybe it's because you look dodgy, or you know, they were looking for someone. And I was like, right, well, it's been happening for the last 20 years. Like I've got 20 years worth of evidence for this that it happens. You know, so it's a little harder to prove, and I think some of these things are ingrained in everyday nature, which makes them harder to remove as well.
Yeah, that's yeah, pretty remarkable. I think, like you say, if any other field, if we'd accumulated 20 years of evidence around a particular behaviour or pattern, we'd be quite convinced of that evidence, wouldn't we?
Oh, 100%, 100%. I think normally these things, when they occur, like if you collated 20 years of evidence on an organization, the onus for that doesn't necessarily fall on one person. But with these things, you know, if someone says something to me and it's a microaggression or subjects me to something, the kind of the blame for that is isolated to one person. So they don't feel, you know, there's not a shared blame essentially. So it's a little harder for them to acknowledge, really, I think. Whereas if that blame was shared, it kind of gets dispersed and it's a little bit easier to deal with.
Right. Oh, I think that's a great sort of setting the scene. And we might circle back to something you and I have spoken about previously, this idea of, which is a very British idea, or certainly within British universities and lad culture of banter. We might bring that up in the discussion, because I think that's particularly important to a sport setting. Not so much sport science, but sort of active sporting environments. But if we could and others are more than welcome to contribute to this. So Yako and Nick, feel free to jump in. And hopefully if Greg hops online, he'll have an idea as well. But I'd just like us to sort of outline what diversity is, why it's important, and then we can sort of steer into this, maybe the differences between like the importance of it academically to sport and exercise to, you know, what's the benefit to our students even.
Of course. So in terms of what it is, we're essentially looking at people of a kind of range of different characteristics or range of different backgrounds. And in terms of that as a culture, it's the recognition and kind of valuing of these range of different characteristics. So valuing the culture of someone who, say, is of Maori descent, or valuing a female's experience and things she has had to go through and things that she can bring to the table. And I think it's more kind of, you know, also creating a culture whereby everyone is valued in that setting as well. In terms of why it's important, I think when we, I suppose, like I kind of alluded to there, when we have a range of different characteristics, we have a diversity of ideas, which is something we've spoken about before. You know, sport itself is very diverse, and if we have people from a range of different backgrounds, we have a greater amount of ideas, and hopefully from that we can get the best idea or the best theory or the best training practice to adopt to get the best outcome. So in terms of that, it's important from a kind of organizational point of view. More diverse organizations where there's greater equality do better. There's less bias. The productivity is better. There's more, or there's greater civility in those organizations as well. And I reckon that would stand for a sports team too.
Yeah. Great stuff. What sort of tangible benefits have you seen to having a more diverse institution or classroom? And like, you shared some really interesting student stories with me when we first caught up. Can you just share some of those with the group?
I can't remember which student story you're referring to now. In terms of kind of like the environment, I kind of, in a kind of teaching setting, I try and make sure that everyone has a kind of equal opportunity to speak, and kind of student bodies. So, for example, my program committees have students from a wide range of backgrounds. Trying to think what story I might have told you now.
I think you mentioned that other students had sort of come to Hartpury off the back of attending other institutions.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. So there's two students, female students, who had gone to other organisations. Cheers for reminding me. There's two students who have come to Hartpury on an S&P degree, who had been told by other organisations or people from other organisations at their open days that there were no jobs for females in strength and conditioning. And then they came to our university open day, spoke with one of my colleagues about that on separate occasions, and kind of, you know, reassured them, you know, if we were to take the English Institute of Sport, the head of strength and conditioning is Michelle Pearson. Like, you know, that's the top position, really, isn't it? Which is occupied by a female. And you know, obviously not all of kind of sport and organisations look like that. I don't want to get into kind of tokenism where they're just kind of suggesting that just because Michelle Pearson has that role that it's equal for all females. It's certainly not like that. But certainly there's a role model there for someone to aspire to, or for a young female to aspire to.
That's cool. I think, yeah, just to direct people who might be watching this that aren't from Wintec to a paper by one of our colleagues and a previous Research Bites guest, Lynn O'Malley, who did her master's in sort of the area of female practitioners in S&C, which was published in the Strength and Conditioning Journal, I think, last year, and really asked the question of high performance coaches within her network of like why there are so few women within strength and conditioning, and particularly within those high paid roles within sort of the Oceania Pacifica type region. So that paper's out there, and it it's something that seemed quite well received by even the NSCA at the time. So it feels a little bit like the tide is turning on maybe women's role within sport and exercise. Although I think what's maybe interesting is that we still have within sport and exercise quite male-dominated roles, quite female-dominated roles, quite. I do think of like strength and conditioning coaches as typically like bald, middle-aged white men. I think that sort of really links back to the tweet that sort of started off our interaction.
Yeah. No, I think it's definitely, in that paper, it kind of cites a lot of the barriers in terms of, being an old boys club, some of the kind of male hierarchy, and kind of this idea of this male heterosexual male, which is really masculine, and how that kind of affects kind of the opportunities and increases the amount of barriers for females wanting to come into that role. And I mean, I think just to feel like going on a bit of a tangent here, but with that example I gave you of an institution on open day telling a 18 or 17, 18-year-old kid that there's no opportunities, kind of imagine some of the things that are going to happen behind closed doors in terms of barriers. Someone's willing to say that out in the open when they're essentially trying to present their best self. Like what's going on behind closed doors that's preventing kind of females from trying to attain these roles. We had a student as well who experienced some sexism on a placement throughout that kind of year's opportunity, and essentially that put her off working in that experience in that setting. And I think one of the important things as well to note is that this isn't a woman problem. This is us as males. This is our issue. Like we need to stop what we're doing. Like we need to reduce these barriers. We can't expect women to kind of fight for their equality when essentially we as males are putting up the barriers. We need to sort ourselves out and make a more inclusive practice, a more diverse practice.
On that idea of barriers then, I don't want this to sound like I'm sort of accepting negative behaviours or microaggressions or anything, but you've got your PhD, you've overcome a lot of barriers yourself, but you still experience a lot of barriers or a lot of negative behaviours. How many chances, like in your experience as an educator and someone who's trying to push people into the industry and provide a pathway for those people, how many chances does it take, or how many setbacks do you think someone will typically encounter or can tolerate before they start looking elsewhere?
It depends really. I think it's kind of obviously going to depend on the person and the severity of kind of what's happened, and I mean how much they can tolerate. And in this case, I don't think that tolerating more is a good thing. It, shouldn't happen in the first place. But how much they're kind of willing to put up with. I think if you're from a minority group, the likelihood is that you would have kind of experienced these things most of your life. Not to go off on a tangent, but I remember like when I was a youngster, my dad telling me things about the way I've got to act in, certain scenarios, and, I'm not going to get second opportunities and things. And that was from a young age when I was like pre-teenager telling me about these things. So, they'll kind of people from minority groups, people of protected characteristics would likely experience these things. So it depends on how much they can tolerate before they kind of look elsewhere. I think as well, it's also dependent on where that person is career-wise. So when I was doing my PhD, at Chester, I felt really kind of protected, in the sense that uh, the kind of my colleagues, my kind of supervisors, the management team were kind of so supportive, and they taught me as an undergrad, and we had lectures on ethnicity and race and like gender and sport and these types of things. So they kind of had a perspective of where I was coming from. So kind of I felt kind of empowered, and if something did happen, I kind of felt supported that I could deal with that because I had that support behind me. But if you're in a organization and you don't have that support, well, you're likely, how does that affect how much you can put up with it? And then the kind of point I was trying to make there, I kind of keep going off on tangents and stuff. It kind of depends where you are at in your, depends where you're at in your life. So, I mean, when I kind of moved and got my first full-time job at Hartpury, when these things would happen, I'd kind of put up with them, not because I didn't feel supported, but because kind of where I was living, my rent, my livelihood depended on being able to have an income. And if I didn't have an income, or something happened, or if I reacted the wrong way and ended up if I reacted the wrong way to something, and I ended up getting overly angry and I put myself in a bad position, then I wouldn't have that income. And that's me as a kind of, when did I start? I was 26. That's me as a kind of like 26-year-old who's been through this a lot, saying that I'm having to bite the bullet on it. But now I'm kind of a bit further down the line. This current kind of setting has helped what we can kind of put up with as well.
No, thanks very much.
I've gone off on several tangents.
No, that's cool. That's great. I think that's really important. And I think that sort of does lead on to the next sort of point I wanted to discuss with you, which I sent through to you, I think earlier in the week. We've got this idea in New Zealand of like the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a founding document for us. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on, does this provide a seemingly good starting point for us to have conversations around the issue of diversity within sport and exercise? So the notions of partnership, which is working together with people from minority groups to develop strategies that are relevant for them, participation within that decision-making process, and then importantly, probably protection, which then offers the same level of care and support, which is something that you've just touched upon there.
I definitely think so. And like you kind of alluded to there, that protection one is really important. If we're going to make our kind of society, our organisation, our sport and organisation, our team, whatever, more diverse, more equal, ultimately there's going to be conversations that need to be had. So that individual that's raising those issues, or those individuals that are kind of highlighting some of the barriers, need to feel protected. They need to know that if they're raising something, that they're going to be treated like their peers. I'm not sure if you kind of links onto this, but you've heard of contact hypothesis. It's a kind of psychological theory whereby kind of your exposure to another group of people under certain circumstances, some of the prejudices. Now, I'll probably get slaughtered by a psychologist for bringing up. I'm not a psychologist, but kind of those three principles kind of fall quite well into that. So the protection one, falls under. So the 4 points, in this contact hypothesis are kind of, you're of an equal status. You kind of have a common goal, your cooperation, or you will cooperate with each other. And then you have kind of the support and the kind of understanding of whoever's in authority. So with that kind of falls quite neatly into that partnership, participation, and protection. So kind of under that participation, you're working together towards something common, a common goal, whether that be as a team, whether that be as an organization. That partnership, again, under that cooperation and being of equal status is really important. and then kind of everything that surrounds that is that protection, because mistakes are going to be made, really.
That's fantastic. I think where, you know, what's sort of come to my mind over the last couple of weeks is that there are maybe solutions and things that we can work on, and that the answers are already out there. We just need to be willing to embody that and sort of lead by example. Again, last time we spoke, sort of not recorded, not for the purposes of this session, you spoke about a couple of sort of this idea of like implicit versus explicit strategies. Now, just for the benefit of people who aren't at Wintec yet, we here have things like Mori Achievement Framework, there's being a Pacifica framework developed. But I think if you, John, could just talk in a more general sense about what you think works in terms of demonstrating diversity and how, again, how that's of benefit to not just the sport and exercise setting, but more generally and then specifically the sport and exercise.
Yeah, so I think, you know, some of those frameworks that you brought up are clearly explicit. They're kind of identifying groups that we need to kind of improve the outcomes for. So it's very explicit. And I think for some people, kind of, you would have seen it with the current movements going on, Black Lives Matter movements, is that a lot of people are really resistant to those explicit type methods. As soon as you say, right, well, actually we need to improve, say, the health outcomes, or like in some of your frameworks, the achievement of Maori students, then people think that that is automatically taken away from their rights and they're having less because of that, when in reality it's not the case. So I think for a lot of people that kind of agree with that and kind of, you know, are pro, not that people maybe necessarily not pro equality, but those people that are openly a bit more kind of pro equality and pro diversity, those explicit methods are going to have an impact on them, because it's something that they can take this framework and go, right, well, I can go and run with that. For other people, you're going to have to work on them a bit more implicitly, in my opinion. You need to, and by that I mean they'll almost not know that they're being subject to diversity. And the example I give of that would be on my lecture side. I will have a range of different abilities. I will have people of different sexes, different genders, of people of different ethnicities, different ages on my slides, and that kind of works as an implicit method to show people that, you know, when we're talking about sport or we're talking about hypertrophy or whatever it might be, that this can be attributed to all those people of different characteristics, of different groups. In terms of how that works within a kind of sporting setting, I think we kind of touched upon bases earlier, and having the equality, diversity and inclusion committee. That's obviously like very explicit. It's targeting what needs to happen and the kind of actions that need to be taken to improve the diversity or whatever it might be within that organisation and within the wider sporting context. And I think those are good, and we could have kind of like conferences that are openly in kind of support or openly kind of tagged as this is here to improve EDI, essentially. So I think they can kind of work in tandem, and I think we've got to have a combination of all of those really to target our people with differing views, to put it diplomatically.
Great. No, it's really helpful. I think from what I'd maybe like to do now, if it's okay with you, is if people, so we've got Tommy's just joined us, we've got Nick and Yako here, and if people have questions, I'd like to sort of open up for questions now, and then we can maybe come back to this idea of areas of best practice and how we can sort of move the conversation forward.
Cool.
Does anyone have any questions for John, or are we going to do the classic thing of sit in silence for a couple of minutes?
Hey, John. My name's Tommy. Just joined into the group right now. I know I'm a little late, but I did have a question. A couple of weeks ago, I might have been last week actually, myself and a colleague of mine, Dr. Frakes, out here in America, we were trying to get a list put together to highlight some of the people of color that were in sports science, medicine, rehab, and the fields alike. And we got a little bit of blowback from that, a little bit of disagreement from some of the other PhDs and people in the field, saying that in and of itself is a bit racist, and it's completely absurd exercise for us to do.
Yep.
And I know I'm just hopping into this call right now. I have no idea what you guys have spoken about already, and if I'm going off on a side topic, please let me know. But I'm curious to know, like, is that an exercise that might be inappropriate, or is that something that you feel like should be done, or what are your thoughts on that altogether?
I mean, I personally don't have a problem with it. When we talk about racism, racism is systematic. It's widespread. Like, some people would argue that you can't be racist to a white person, because no matter what you kind of say or do, the white person in that scenario has the power still. So I've not made my mind up on that, to be honest. So I'm not sure whether kind of in that scenario that would be kind of racist or not. But ultimately, what you're trying to do here is you're recognizing a problem. Now, that problem is a lack of diversity within sports sciences. And if it takes you creating a list of people to achieve that, I can't fathom how that is negative, really. If you think that creating a list of people whereby someone can improve diversity is wrong, I can't get. I don't understand your point. I don't understand your point of view. I'm wording myself really badly here. But I think one of the comments, because I think I saw those series of tweets. Someone commented that people of color don't want handouts. I've never seen a person of color ask for a handout. It's just dismissing the problem. I actually almost went on a Twitter rant about this when I saw it, but I thought I'd best not to. But my point would be this: if a person of color does get a handout, is that enough to overcome 20, 30, a whole lifetime's worth of oppression? Your one handout at one webinar, is that enough to overcome it? No, it's not. Is your one handout going to change the system? And I mean, you look at some webinars and people are giving handouts to their friends that look the same as them. So, not that I'm saying it's tit for tat, but ultimately it's going to be a positive outcome if you do give a handout, or whatever you want to call it, to this person of color. I personally see no problems in creating the list. I see problems with people calling it a handout. It's kind of making a bit of a mockery of kind of what people of color have had to go through in this scenario. I was going to make another point. I can't remember. I got lost in my rant.
I thought there was something very interesting when I first made the list. When I had posted it, when I had tweeted it, it actually got a lot of people involved. Now, here's the issue that I had. While it did have a lot of people involved in the very beginning, I mean, we're talking about people from all over the world. PhDs, MSCs, people that were aspiring to be in the field. And I had this one issue. And the one issue was that, I still feel uncomfortable saying it like this white person, right? But I'm trying to get used to bringing things up like this. But a few of these people kind of disregarded the whole people of color portion of that and just started tagging their friends and other researchers. And we had over, there was probably like 150, 200 people tagged, but the majority of them were still white people. And it kind of like reinforces the whole point of the exercise, right? You guys completely disregarded the part where we wanted to highlight the people of color. And it was basically like tagging your Boys and Girls Club and your friends and things like that. But I understand that, I don't think anyone did it with bad intentions. They kind of just breezed over it. But at the same time, that kind of highlights some of the things that we need to be aware of.
100%. And I think as soon as I saw that, I kind of sent it to a few of my mates, and I was just like, I knew this was going to happen. I mean, I think what's funny is that on a series of those tweets, that even though people had kind of overlooked or misread or whatever, the people that they tagged were still all white, which raises a problem in itself in that, I mean, they'll probably come back and give me stick for this, but consciously or unconsciously, they're not valuing like people of color, because they saw that they had to class experts, they saw that they had to tag their friends or experts or whatever they ended up doing, and those people all looked like them. So, I mean, if you looked at like the range of people that got tagged in that are of color, and some absolutely brilliant people, some absolutely amazing people that were getting tagged, like the people that I didn't know, and I was like, damn, this person's like a professor in this institution. I was like, can be like them, kind of thing. And like these people weren't getting tagged in those other tweets despite their really high status. And it just kind of goes to show kind of that unconscious bias that's there, really. And I mean, in fairness, a few people kind of came out of it and were like, oh, I didn't realise, and whatever, but it still highlighted the bias.
Great question, Tommy. That was fantastic and good discussion as well. Cheers for that. Nick is sat in a room next to where an exam's happening, so can't physically ask this question. That's just appeared on the chat. But Nick's asked, just in case it doesn't come up on the screen recording, so what kind of makeup in terms of gender, ethnicity are we seeing in the UK undergrad in sports science degrees? And Tommy, you could even give it like a US perspective in terms of what you've seen throughout your studies as well.
Yeah, so we kind of where we are, and I'll kind of speak on kind of about Hartpury here, because I couldn't give you any statistics on kind of like holistically in the UK, but where we are, we're really rural, that kind of doesn't really lend itself to a lot of diversity, to be honest. But in our kind of, if we were to take sport and exercise sciences, which is the degree that I run, there's of the 67 of them in my course, there's maybe only a few people of color, and there's maybe about 30% females. So it's really low. It's maybe on some of the other courses, it might be a little bit better in terms of diversity, but marginally. It certainly doesn't represent the society, like the broader society in the country.
Do you feel that's compounded at your institute, given its I feel I can say this because I'm collaborating with your colleague Jane Williams at the moment as well. So do you feel it's sort of compounded by the fact that Hartpury has this equestrian reputation, and that's potentially again skews the demographic one way or another?
I'm not sure. Do you know what? I'm not sure whether the kind of like equestrian side has a kind of a massive effect on that, because I think if you're, for all the people that come into sport courses, they kind of see it for the sports academy, or they would lean towards the sports academy as opposed to the equestrian side of things. But I think certainly with it being rural, like we're 6 miles outside of Gloucester, so you're either going to have to take a bus in or you're going to have to drive in. Now, that lends itself to people of a kind of certain socioeconomic status who kind of own cars become. I mean, certainly when I looked at unis, I wanted somewhere where I could walk in because I didn't have a car, and growing up in London, I couldn't afford to take driving tests or driving lessons, so I had to pick somewhere that I could walk to.
Cool. Tom, have you anything to add from sort of a US perspective there, or someone who's in the industry?
As far as the gender and the ethnicity, here in California where I am, I think it's actually pretty well mixed. But like I said, America's huge, right? So you'll still have some areas in the deep South or in the Midwest that I believe, I don't have any personal experience with the institutions out there, but I do believe that it's a lot less mixed in those areas. But here on the West Coast, where it's a far left-leaning, a little bit more liberal and progressive, we have a wide range of all types of ethnicities and backgrounds in our sports science field.
Nice, that's really positive to hear. I wonder then if, just looking at the time, this has sort of flown by, and I think we've had some good discussion so far. But if we could just maybe spend sort of 5 minutes sort of recapping and areas of best practice, and then if we've got any further questions we can add on, or we can sort of end it at the 50-minute mark. So John, if you can talk us through, what we should be doing, what we maybe need to have a bit more of an honest think about in sport and exercise science, and we love to end on a positive. So if you've got anything that you feel good about at the moment, please share that with us as well.
So in terms of kind of best practice, I think we need to identify the groups that we're not recruiting from, or we're not kind of attaining people from. So whether that be kind of gender, sex inequalities, or kind of ethnic minorities, we need to identify them and kind of then identify if there's any barriers that are preventing us from recruiting people. And here, I guess I'm kind of speaking more from a kind of bigger organizational perspective, but we need to identify that. Once we kind of done that, then we can kind of go about seeing how we can improve recruitment from those areas. And I think how that kind of occurs, I think, largely that might be based upon kind of a marketing team in the organization, going out to certain areas where, maybe certain ethnic minorities, or there's a higher proportion of them going into schools to try and recruit from those populations. And then I think the discussions really need to be honest. And I think now is the kind of, I say now is the time to do that, but it's always been the time to do that. It should have always happened. But I think now, unfortunately, it's taken, George Floyd getting murdered for this to happen. But the discussions right now are really open and honest from what I can see. People have really come around to acknowledging the issues that people have as individuals, their kind of biases, and from a kind of wider perspective that organizations have. So I think that's really positive. But, mistakes are going to be made. It's not going to be perfect. It's going to take years and years. We're kidding ourselves if we think that this is going to happen overnight. But hopefully kind of change is going to come. In terms of one thing, and from my personal experience, and this is maybe more of an individual perspective, but I think we really need to protect individuals from kind of minority groups when they're raising the issues. So if there's plenty of examples of people being silenced because they've raised issues of inequality, or people being made to leave organizations because of that, and that really is a barrier. What people need to understand is having an equal and more diverse society is better for everyone. So there's going to be mistakes made. If someone highlights an issue, they're not necessarily highlighting it with you, but they're highlighting that something needs to be done. So we really need to kind of, I'm only meaning protect those individuals. I don't mean mollycoddle them, but make sure that they feel that they can come out and say those things for for the better of the organisation, really. And I think that would be the kind of main thing. Like I said, to kind of finish on a positive note, I think there's a current intensity at the moment that's lending itself to reducing these inequalities. We need to keep that momentum up. Things like this are really positive. I think there's things that we can do as individuals in terms of, you know, changing lecture slides, making a classroom safe for everyone to speak out, making our club safe, or our team safe. And ultimately, kind of the organisation has to take a kind of top-down approach too as well, which, fingers crossed, with this current intensity is happening.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that. I think if we will sort of end it there, so I'll stop the recording now. But just prior to that, I'd like to, you know, thank you, John, again for your time. It's been a really interesting conversation. And I think it was nice to get out of the typical research format of like, here's my PowerPoint presentation. Aren't I good at putting together a PowerPoint presentation? And just have a genuine conversation about this. Just for people who are maybe new to Research Bites, who might be watching off the back of this, we do have a bit of a back catalogue. And although, John, I believe you're our first, or one of our first people of colour who we've had speak, we do have quite a lot of female participants and speakers. So, you know, we are trying to be inclusive, and we are trying to sort of lead by example as opposed to instruction. So thanks again, John, for your time. I really appreciate it. And it's something that I think we can keep learning from and hopefully sort of put to good use going forwards. But congrats again on your position with Bases. I think you're going to be a massive asset to them, because you're clearly very passionate about the area. So
yeah, thank you for having me on, and thanks for it's my first time doing something like this and speaking on a topic like this, which is really nice, to be honest, and kind of being able to share my thoughts. I appreciate that, and for kind of just setting up this discussion as well. I think it's really positive from not just this discussion, but our other ones as well. What you guys at WinTech are doing is really positive, and you're clearly taking the lead on that. And it's really nice to see. And hopefully it can make some really positive things happen with Bases too.